Donald Wallenfang, secular Discalced Carmelite and professor of theology and philosophy at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. A great joy once again to welcome you to these video presentations in week 4 on the interior castle commentary. You notice I have a new look. I have my large brown scapular on as a fully professed secular Discalced Carmelite, and I put it on a bit for a symbolic effect as we enter the 4th dwelling places, having passed through the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd dwelling places. The 4th dwelling places are now where things get very intimate in the spiritual life. You'll also notice in this video, you're not seeing images and little video clips dropped in. This is also to bring home the point that as we move deeper into the interior castle of the soul, we're thinking less about things of the world, growing in greater detachment to things. So the video itself, I hope just my speaking about these things with reference to the work of Saint Teresa of Avila is enough, and I'll try to keep it concise as we discuss the 4th dwelling places of the soul. In the first chapter of the 4th dwelling places, paragraph 1, Saint Teresa says that the supernatural experiences in the spiritual life begin here. Comienzan a ser cosas sobrenaturales. Here's where the supernatural things literally begin. So, namely, what supernatural things? What she calls in Spanish gustos, spiritual delights, which refers specifically to infused recollection. It's a passive stage of the contemplative prayer where God is doing everything in the soul, in contrast with what she calls contentos, or consolations, as it's translated. For example, feelings, overwhelming feelings of joy, peace, and satisfaction, which are acquired as a result of prayer and virtuous living. So there's a distinction, important distinction she's making here, especially with these 4th dwelling places, between gustos and contentos, spiritual delights and consolations. Spiritual delights happen in the passive stages of contemplative prayer, beginning that prayer of recollection, the passive phase of the prayer of recollection, and the contentos can happen anywhere really along the way, and as we'll hear, can be tied to just common lived experiences that cause things like joy, peace, and satisfaction. Further in chapter 1 of the 4th dwelling places, St. Teresa writes, "It will seem that to reach these 4th dwelling places, one will have had to live in the others a long while." In the Spanish, mucho tiempo, a long time. Yet the Lord gives when He desires, as He desires, and to whom He desires. Since these blessings belong to Him, He does no injustice to anyone. So it's true to say, in general, it takes a while for a soul to reach the 4th dwelling places. We could say probably, in most cases, years and years. St. Teresa herself lived in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd dwelling places, she recounts, for at least a decade of her life. So she's a great saint and doctor of the church. This is what's happening in her experience. Those of us who are trying to follow her lead shouldn't be surprised if this spiritual life takes a while to unfold. Nevertheless, she insists that God surprises us. Da el Señor, the Lord gives, cuando quiere, when He wants, y como quiere, and how He wants, y a quien quiere, and to whom He wants, when He wants. God, it's up to Him when He floods the soul with spiritual delight. Typically it doesn't happen to anyone anytime, but it would involve a high degree of predisposing oneself to these higher stages of prayer. But nevertheless, God can strike like a bolt of lightning within the soul, and all of a sudden one is experiencing spiritual delight. Never in itself the point. Spiritual delight in itself is not the point, but the point is God, union with God. Further, in chapter 1 of the Fourth Dwelling Places, paragraph 3, St. Teresa says that poisonous creatures, las cosas ponzoñosas, rarely enter these dwelling places. Poisonous creatures rarely enter the fourth dwelling places. So this is really good news. If a soul has journeyed within itself to the fourth dwelling places, poisonous creatures are not really found there. They don't disturb the soul, distract the soul, like in the first, second, and third dwelling places. Further, when a soul is in one continual state, she says, I don't consider it safe. Nor do I think it is possible for the Spirit of the Lord to be in one fixed state during this exile of this life. So she's saying in the spiritual life we have to be moving. She says, for example, love itself is never idle. It's either expanding or contracting, dilating or constricting. So a soul is not meant to be stagnant, but there's always more spiritual labor to be done. And that's a great gift from God, to put our hand to the plow in the spiritual life, to till the field that we might harvest a great produce to share with the world, is the Carmelite thing. Further, she says, joyful consolations, los contentos in prayer, have their beginning in our own human nature and end in God. This is the way of contentos. They begin very naturally with good experiences in this life, and we feel content. We feel a sense of consolation, like life is good. I'm going to keep on the journey. I've had good results with this hard work. I'm going to do more. And in the spiritual life, the same sort of thing. I feel these good things in prayer, and I want to keep praying and keep experiencing this, these contentos with God. But this happens especially with the prayer of meditation, vocal prayer, meditation, good experiences, and communal prayer and individual prayer. But the spiritual delights, los gustos, begin in God and God alone. We don't generate them from our own labors. They come out of nowhere, so to speak. They come totally from God and surprise us. Then she reflects on Psalm 119, verse 32, as she prayed in the divine office, in the Latin, cum dilatasti cor meum. Talking about when you enlarged my heart, when the Lord enlarged my heart. Cum dilatasti cor meum. These words, she says, are sufficient to describe the experience of receiving spiritual delights, los gustos. That God enlarges the heart, expands the heart, widens the heart. This is what happens when we receive spiritual delights in the fourth dwelling places and beyond. Further, in chapter 1 of the fourth dwelling places, St. Teresa writes that, she says, I only wish to inform you that in order to profit by this path and ascend to the dwelling places we desire, the important thing is not to think much, but to love much. No está la cosa en pensar mucho, sino en amar mucho. The important thing as we ascend to the higher, more interior dwelling places is not to think much, but to love much. Amar mucho. And so, do that which best stirs you to love. A huge piece of advice for the spiritual life. Do that which best stirs you to love. Love like God loves. Love in a way that is totally self-giving, totally solicitous for the good of the other, the full good of the other, the full good of all other people. Love like this. Love in the way God created us to love with the love who God is. Do that which best stirs you to love. That's a Carmelite compass. We know we're on the right track when we're pursuing what best stirs us to love. She goes on to say, perhaps we don't know what love is. I wouldn't be very surprised, because it does not consist in great delight, but in desiring with strong determination to please God in everything, and striving insofar as possible not to offend Him, and in asking Him for the advancement of the honor and glory of His Son and the increase of the Catholic Church. El aumento de la Iglesia Católica. It's a very comprehensive understanding of what consists in love, what love consists of. Desiring with strong determination, rather than consisting in great delights. No está en el mayor gusto, sino en la mayor determinación. Not in great delights is love, but this desiring with strong determination to please God in everything, striving in so as far as possible not to offend Him. These are the signs of love. And the increase, he says, of the Catholic Church, the fullness of the church Jesus founded, the fullness of truth, the city on a hill in this world, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So a criterion for spiritual authenticity is this reference to the increase of the Catholic Church. Very important point she makes here. This is not a spiritual but not religious kind of thing, this interior castle. It has everything to do with the fullness of faith and reason as put forward by the Catholic Church, especially the teachings of the Church, the liturgies of the Church, everything that overflows out of the Church. Further, in the first chapter of the Fourth Dwelling Places, St. Teresa talks about what she calls a suspension that is meant to accompany prayer. When suspension, suspensión, does accompany the prayer, no pain is felt until the suspension passes. So we talk about in the spiritual life a kind of ecstasy that happens, a lifting, a rising above, a kind of pain and torment that's part of the dark night of the soul growing in the spiritual life. But God lifts the soul, at least on occasion, especially through these spiritual delights in the passive prayer of recollection, the prayer of quiet, the prayer of union. It's not a constant suspension, but there's a lift and then a passing of the suspension or the bracketing of the pain and the suffering. But again, the point isn't a matter of spiritual painkillers here. The point is that we lean into the suffering, and if God grants us relief, praise God for that. It seems at times if He doesn't, we would die out of just being overwhelmed by the magnitude of divine love. As St. Teresa writes in a poem, I die because I do not die. But fortunately, God gives the soul a time of relief on occasion as needed, suspensión. And this is a very important part of the Fourth Dwelling Places and beyond. Further, she says that this disquiet and war in the spiritual life can be suffered if we find peace where we live. The question is, where do you live in your spiritual life? where do you live in general? Not just your home address, your temporary home address, you can point on the map, but in your soul, where do you live? Disquiet and war, the fact that we have not finally arrived in our eternal home, it can be suffered if we find peace where we live. St. Paul talks about this in his letter to the Philippians, that he longs to depart from this world and be united to Christ, for that is far better. But if Jesus wants him to remain in the flesh and engage in fruitful labor for the kingdom, he's content about that because he finds peace where he lives. Finally, in chapter 1 of the Four Dwelling Places, this is paragraph 13 toward the end, St. Teresa is thinking about how even in the Four Dwelling Places we're getting into contemplative prayer, but our intellect and our will, sometimes the memory, is still kind of active. And this can be a distraction. And the imagination, she says the human imagination with what floods it in a kind of constant way is a result even of the fall of original sin. And we're not able to rest often because our imagination just runs wild in multiple directions and so fast, and especially as we're stimulated these days by so many sights and sounds and perceptions. She says, nevertheless, we must let the mill clapper go clacking on and must continue grinding our flour in the spiritual life and not fail to work with the will and the intellect. So there's a lot within imagination that wants to distract, wants to pull us this way and that way, keep us from this restfulness in God. But we have to utilize these higher faculties of our soul, the will to intend a love of God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves, and the intellect to think of the things of God. Think of what is noble, what is worthy of praise, what is wholesome, as St. Paul talks about in his letters. So we have to continue to utilize the higher faculties of the soul as we move into the fourth dwelling places, but nevertheless these too will be emptied as we proceed into the passive stages of contemplative prayer, beginning with the passive phase of the prayer of recollection, again moving on to the prayer of quiet and prayer of union. So thank you for thinking with me through the beginnings of the fourth dwelling places, and we look forward to the next video segment, which will continue here, trying to understand what St. Teresa is talking about with the fourth dwelling places of the soul.